What's going on, guys? This is VinylicPuma, back with another Borderlands Countdown video, and today I wanted to go over 10 guns and weapons that we've seen in Borderlands 1, 2, and the pre-sequel that we, or at least I, would like to see return in Borderlands 3. Now, obviously, there are well over 10 guns that could have appeared on this list, so if you don't see your favorites here, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad, it just means that the ones that do appear here tend to be my favorites. Also, I'm trying to strike a balance between all three core series games released so far, that way each game gets some representation without Borderlands 2 totally hijacking the list to the point where everything is from Borderlands 2. As always, leave your thoughts and some of your personal favorites you'd like to see return for Borderlands 3 in the comments section below. However, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with number 10, and that is going to be the Phrygia SMG. I guess it's dependent on whether Cryo makes a return for Borderlands 3, but I would really like to see the Phrygia from Borderlands the pre-sequel return. After all, this was a really great SMG that could be used to freeze enemies and potentially set them up for other attacks. Or you could even just spam it at enemy crit spots for massive damage. This made the Phrygia a great utility weapon for freezing enemies, as well as just a good weapon for all-out offensives. Assuming Cryo doesn't return though, I think it would be cool if a weapon similar to it, like the Slagga, did end up returning, as it was always nice to have a gun that's really good at applying some kind of status effect debuff to various enemies. In fact, you could potentially rename the Phrygia or Slagga to something new and simply allow it to come in a few different elemental debuff varieties like Slag, Cryo, and whatever else you might want to include for Borderlands 3. That way, you essentially get the effects of the Phrygia, but on an SMG that's just a lot more flexible overall due to the amount of elemental variety. It's highly likely Borderlands 3 will use some type of status debuff, however, if it ends up using Cryo, it would be pretty cool to see the Phrygia make a return for Borderlands 3. Number 9. Classic TDR Legendaries from Borderlands 1. Something that was cool from Borderlands 1 and would be really cool to see in Borderlands 3 would be the return of classic TDR Legendaries. Guns like the Guardian Combat Rifle, Savior SMG, Protector Pistol, Equalizer Revolver, and Defender Shotgun were really neat because they allowed the player to passively regenerate ammo during and outside of fights. I suppose it's worth mentioning that this property returned to some extent in Borderlands 2 in the form of the Avenger SMG. However, for the most part, ammo regeneration ended up being locked to skills or specific class mods, which also carried over to Borderlands the pre-sequel. I always thought this was unfortunate because certain characters could really benefit from some kind of passive ammo regen, but can't because it's been locked to action skills or character-unique class mods for the last two games. Even if we don't get the Equalizer, Guardian, Savior, Protector, or Defender specifically, it would be cool to see this ammo regeneration property return for all of the TDR gear that's of legendary rarity or higher. That way, every character can regenerate ammo in Borderlands 3, independent of skills and character-specific class mods. Number 8. The Hellfire SMG. One thing that I think we can all agree on is that it wouldn't feel right if Borderlands 3 didn't feature the Hellfire in some way. After all, the Hellfire has been present in all of the games released so far, and it would be a shame to not see it return in the much-anticipated third entry for the Borderlands series. What I think has made the Hellfire such an appealing weapon in all of the Borderlands games is that it deals quite a bit of damage through damage over time. While the initial projectiles are decently strong, it's really the dots that are supposed to make enemies fall, which was always really fun to watch in the original Borderlands. Unfortunately, due to Borderlands 2's crazy scaling in Ultimate Voltage mode, the Hellfire became a bit weaker, but I would still say it's an excellent SMG late game due to how easy it is to acquire. Ultimately though, the Hellfire is a pretty cool weapon, and for Borderlands 3, it would be cool to get a Hellfire that feels and functions like the Borderlands 1 variant, with either the look of the Borderlands 2 in the pre-sequel version, or maybe even an entirely new design. Hopefully the Hellfire returns in Borderlands 3 because it seems like such a standard for the series at this point. Number 7. The Becca Assault Rifle. Out of all of Borderlands 2's pearlescence, I'd really like to see the Becca return in Borderlands 3, as I think it properly represents the rarity. Plus, it's also just a really cool assault rifle as it allows you to potentially fire 4 shots for the cost of 1 with this cool delayed effect. More specifically, the Becca's initial projectile travels like normal, only for the secondary projectile to stop in mid-air and then start again while also simultaneously splitting into 3 projectiles for increased damage. Also, and due to the nature of Jacob's ARs, which allow you to fire as fast as you can pull the trigger, the Becca can be really fun to spam and watch all of the secondary projectiles hit your intended targets. If you happen to be really skilled and you can properly gauge the distance at which those projectiles split, you can even potentially get all 4 projectiles to crit, yielding massive damage. I'd say if I could only pick one pearlescent from Borderlands 2 that would be able to return in Borderlands 3, I would have to pick this thing because it's just a really cool AR, it's got great special effect, and I overall think it's pretty memorable. Number 6. Kanada's Laser. While I suspect lasers will make an appearance in Borderlands 3, one weapon that shares properties with the laser without technically being one is Kanada's Laser. This really powerful rocket launcher is based off of the Arasaka heavy laser rifle from the Akira manga or anime and functions similarly as well. The player simply pulls the trigger, a laser emits and explodes with whatever it comes into contact with. As you can imagine, this ends up being fairly powerful in Borderlands the pre-sequel due to the mechanics around cryo. Between the high base damage Kanada's Laser provides, as well as the damage bonuses that can be dealt to frozen enemies from both explosive and critical damage, you can easily rack up damage numbers in the millions, effectively one-shotting most mobs. If Cryo Element ends up returning in Borderlands 3, I can imagine Kanada's Laser being a really great launcher to have, since it was so good in the pre-sequel. Plus, it's also possible Kanada's Laser could go well with the other newly introduced mechanics in Borderlands 3 that we aren't aware of yet. Number 5. The Sandhawk SMG. Honestly, for this specific entry, it was between the Pimpernel and the Sandhawk, and I chose to go with the Sandhawk because I think more people are likely familiar with it. However, just because I didn't include the Pimpernel on this list doesn't mean that it shouldn't return, as the Pimpernel was a very unique and powerful sniper. I just chose the Sandhawk since I figured most people are probably a little bit more familiar with it. As for the Sandhawk though, it's just a really powerful SMG with its signature flying bird projectile pattern. It ended up being a really big part of Borderlands 2 due to its synergy with the B-Shield, and I think it would be great to include just for the sake of nostalgia. Plus, if the B-Shield returns in Borderlands 3, the Sandhawk will definitely complement it and be a great option for farming. However, even if the B-Shield doesn't return, I think it still has the potential to be a great part of people's arsenals due to its impressive damage output and ability to come in all elements. All in all, I hope the Sandhawk returns for Borderlands 3. Plus, I would assume if we end up seeing Captain Scarlet in Borderlands 3 at all, it seems like the Sandhawk, along with the 12-pounder launcher, Greed Pistol, Jolly Roger shotgun, Pimpernel sniper rifle, and Stinkpot AR, all stand a pretty good chance of returning as well. Number 4. The Long Nails Sniper Rifle. I suppose you could also include the Trespasser from Borderlands 2 here as well, but I think it's really the Long Nail that was probably the best shield bypass sniper from both games. After all, it's kind of hard for a Jacob's bolt-action sniper to compete with a Vladov Droog, thanks to the Droog's superior fire rates, which just so happens to contribute to better DPS overall. I also think this weapon could benefit from a few small tweaks if it does get included. For example, maybe shock versions could be tweaked to not allow for any dot chance, which could also allow the player to deal the enhanced damage you would normally deal to shock directly to a target's health bar. Alternatively, maybe if you got a fire or corrosive version, the dots would ignore the shield and directly apply to the target's health bar as well, which could prove useful up against certain enemies like Iridians, provided they're anything like the ones from Borderlands 1. Assuming Cryo returns and no changes are made though, it will still be a lot of fun to freeze enemies that still have their shields up, and then pick them off with subsequent shots or by swapping to some other weapon. Shield bypass effects have always been cool in Borderlands games, and assuming we don't get a Vault Hunter that has a shield bypass skill that's similar to Mordecai's Trespass from the first game, I'd definitely like to see the Long Nail return, as it was a really cool legendary sniper that was both really fun to use in addition to being fairly powerful. Number 3. The Unkempt Herald Pistol. So this is an overpowered weapon that actually ended up getting cut from the pre-sequel due to concerns of it being too powerful. At the time, I think it was probably a good idea since the Unkempt Herald had a tendency to dominate the higher level areas of Borderlands 2, and it was almost seen as mandatory to progress through those portions of the game. In retrospect, however, I think the real issue wasn't so much the Unkempt Herald itself, but rather the lack of viable gear in Ultimate Voltage mode and OP8 difficulties. Consider this for a moment. In pretty much every Pokemon game that's been released since the 90s, Mewtwo has always been considered overpowered and potentially stronger than a lot of the other Pokemon. However, as new games got made, the developers incorporated things that made Mewtwo less of a go-to strategy. Rather than just getting rid of Mewtwo or nerfing him, new features and weaknesses were introduced, making it possible to actually counter Mewtwo. As this pertains to Borderlands though, I'd like to see Gearbox do something similar with the Unkempt Herald, along with some of the other overpowered guns I've previously and will soon mention. Keep a lot of these weapons' crazy overpowered natures, but maybe make enemies that are explosive immune, amp shield immune, or something else to encourage players to figure out alternative strategies and use other types of in-game items. Ultimately, I'd like to see the Unkempt Herald return, because I think if certain accommodations were made that didn't necessarily make it the best strategy, you could still get a lot of use out of it, while also preventing it from totally and utterly dominating the vast majority of the other loot that's present in Borderlands 3. Number 2. The Norfleet Launcher. Even though the Norfleet, like the Herald, has a reputation for being overpowered, I think it would be a shame to not have a launcher as ridiculous as the Norfleet is return in Borderlands 3. I've always been a big fan of the Doom games, and having something that's comparable to the BFG in a PvE shooter like Borderlands seems like a must. Plus, I don't think the Norfleet is as imbalanced as many people claim. While it's true that the Norfleet is really overpowered up against most generic mobs, it's not really as useful up against Borderlands 2's raid bosses, which are usually easier to take down with the more conventional but higher tier gear like the Unkempt Herald, Interfacer, or Conference Call. And even if the Norfleet is technically unbalanced, I'd still say it's pretty fun and useful, especially once you pair it with an absorption shield, as it makes recompleting playthroughs you reset in Ultimate Vault Hunter mode a lot easier. I also think a part of me would also like to see Gearbox bring back the Norfleet, because I'd like to see how and if they can outdo it. Perhaps we could see something overpowered like Titanfall's Smart Pistol, or maybe even an advanced version of the ZX-1 from the pre-sequel, where bullets simply just teleport into enemies, dealing massive damage. In the end though, the Norfleet is really a staple of Borderlands 2, and it would really be a shame if it didn't return in Borderlands 3. After all, it was so awesome, and it would be a shame to see it go. And finally, number 1, the Ajax Ogre Combat Rifle. While the Ogre makes its appearance in Borderlands 2, and the original Borderlands 1 Ogre was a pretty great weapon on its own, it's really the Ajax Ogre that's probably the best ever, and it's something that I think many, myself included, would like to see return in Borderlands 3. This comes down to its hybrid weapon status, where it combines unique parts from both the Ajax Spear and Legendary Ogre combat rifles. The Ogre's explosive accessory ends up powering the Ajax Ogre's massive damage, while the Ajax Spear's barrel provides it with better recoil reduction, reduced spread, as well as improving damage. Thus, what you ultimately get is a combat rifle that is capable of very high DPS, while also having great accuracy and recoil control. Even though it would be nice to see the base Ogre return in Borderlands 3, I think we all know that the Ajax Ogre was the GOAT, and assuming Borderlands 3 doesn't feature hybrids, I do hope that Borderlands 3's Ogre will act and feel a lot more like the Ajax Ogre did, as opposed to the base Borderlands 1 or Borderlands 2 variants. Overall, this would be an awesome combat rifle to see return as an AR in Borderlands 3, since it was one of, if not the best weapons from Borderlands 1. Alright guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you liked this video, feel free to leave a like, click the bell so you can be notified when I upload more videos, and as always, and again, thank you all so much for supporting this channel. Take care, and I'll see you all in the next one.